Ads are everywhere now, which means everybody is trying to make theirs work better. And most ad analysis tools do something very reasonable. They look at click-through rate, watch time, conversion rate, and return on ad spend. That is the normal way to judge whether an ad is doing its job. Then, we wanted to ask a much stranger question. What if a model looked at a video and tried to predict brain response patterns from it? Because apparently just watching the ad was no longer enough. Brain response patterns. Casually. That is what Tribe is about. It is not a chatbot. It is not ask the model a question and get a neat paragraph back. Tribe takes video, audio, and text and predicts patterns of brain activity the content might be associated with, which is a sentence that sounds fake right up until you realize Meta actually built it. So we wanted to test it properly. Could Tribe tell us anything useful about ad creative in a real workflow? And part of what made it worth looking at was the timing. At that point, Meta did not exactly feel like the company setting the tone in the public AI conversation. A lot of the energy was elsewhere. A lot of the attention was going to more familiar product shapes. So seeing Meta show up with something this different felt notable. But the real question was still practical. Does any of this belong in a workflow? Because interesting research and useful workflow are two different standards. Is this a weird and ambitious piece of research? Obviously. The harder question is whether it stays reasonable once it meets an actual machine, an actual file, and an actual wait time. So the plan was simple. Run a real A versus B experiment and see what survived contact with reality. And before there was any result, there was setup. There was gated model access. There were Hugging Face authentication issues. There was the discovery that TribeEv2 was not a normal package you could just install and move on with your life. There were environment mismatches and dependency problems. There was the broader experience of taking a research stack and politely asking it to behave like a product. It was not immediately persuaded. So the workflow moved into Google Colab on a Tesla T4, which sounds encouraging until you remember that it runs and this is practical are not the same sentence. Eventually, the setup friction gave way to the actual experiment. 2 videos went through the Tribe pipeline in a blind A versus B comparison. The output was reduced into measurements that were easier to reason about. Hook strength, overall average response, and peak ROI response, peak timing, and a set of cortical regions used as rough proxies for attention, salience, control, evaluation, and higher-level meaning. In plain English, the question was simple. Which video seems more likely to trigger a stronger pay attention to this response? Not in a mystical way. Not in a literal mind-reading way. Tribe is not reading a real person's brain. It is predicting response patterns from the content of the video. That distinction matters, because otherwise this turns into fake sci-fi very quickly. And once the pipeline finally got through the setup and the waiting, it did actually produce a real answer. The output was not random noise. Tribe-style signals favored video A. Video A showed the stronger early hook. It showed stronger peak responses too. Several target regions also leaned higher for A. If the model had been allowed to cast a confident vote, it would have had opinions. And this is where the experiment became actually useful, because the business result went the other way. Video B had ROAS above 3, while video A was closer to 2.5. So the model favorite and the market winner were not the same thing. The model favored video lost in the market. That does not mean the model output was nonsense. It means the mismatch is the real story. Because now the question is not, can this model produce output? Clearly it can. The more important question is, what kind of output this actually is. Tribe looks more useful as a research and interpretation layer, something that surfaces structured differences between creatives and helps produce better hypotheses. That is not the same thing as a standalone winner picker. And the runtime had opinions too. Running the stack locally on a 16GB MacBook was slow and fragile. Running it in Colab on a Tesla T4 worked, but only in a limited sense. Each short clip still took about 3.5 hours to encode. So this was less quick scoring pass. And more excellent, the rest of the day has made other plans. Practical tools do not only need to be smart, they need to be usable. And this workflow is not ready to behave like a casual product feature. So if something like this ever becomes a real tool, it is not running on a laptop. It is not living on a low-cost VPS. It needs a dedicated GPU-backed path. And definitely not a workflow pretending this is some light little background check you run before lunch. That makes the operational takeaway almost as important as the model takeaway. There is one more constraint sitting quietly on top of all of that. Tribe v2 is under a non-commercial license. So even if the workflow were faster, this exact model still is not something you casually drop into a product and call finished. Which brings us back to the original question. Can this help judge whether a video ad is good or bad? It can produce structured signals that are interesting enough to study, but not reliable enough to trust on their own, and not cheap enough to treat like a normal scoring layer. That is not the clean cinematic success story people usually want from this kind of experiment. It is, however, a real answer. And in some ways, it is the better answer, because the gap between model reward and market reward is the part worth taking seriously. That gap is where the useful questions begin. What exactly is it seeing? What is it missing? And when does that difference matter? That is a much better place for an experiment to end than a fake victory lap.